The bustling energy of New York City pulsed through the air on a crisp fall afternoon. Crowds moved along Fifth Avenue, a mosaic of tourists, professionals, and everyday New Yorkers navigating their own paths. The streets buzzed with life as a saxophonist played a soulful tune. Vendors called out to potential customers, and the scent of street food filled the air. Jasmine Carter strode down the sidewalk with the quiet confidence of someone who knew exactly who she was. Clad in a chic navy trench coat and heels that clicked sharply against the pavement, she had a commanding presence. At 28, Jasmine was a well-known blogger, social justice advocate, and voice for the voiceless. Her platform, Unfiltered Truth, had amassed millions of followers. Her posts were raw and powerful, challenging societal norms and advocating for marginalized communities. Her followers, fondly called Carter's Crew, looked to her as a beacon of truth in a world that often felt unjust. But Jasmine wasn't here for attention today. She had just left a meeting with an editor at a publishing house. Her dream of turning her blog into a book was on the verge of becoming a reality. Her heart was still racing with excitement, her mind filled with ideas and plans. But as she walked past the entrance to a coffee shop, she felt a strange tension in the air, a sensation of being watched. Officer Ray Thompson stood at the corner, his gaze fixed on the street. He was a veteran with the NYPD, tall and muscular, with a square jaw and piercing blue eyes. Years of patrolling the streets had hardened him, and he wore an expression that brooked no nonsense. He had recently been assigned to this district after an incident in his former precinct. A disciplinary transfer, some whispered. Ray was known for his strict adherence to rules, but his approach often came off as heavy-handed. A report had come through his radio, describing a suspicious individual fitting Jasmine's description. The tip was vague, mentioning nothing more than a black woman in a trench coat acting strangely. Ray scanned the street and spotted Jasmine. Something about her confidence, her unhurried stride, triggered an unconscious bias. She looked too self-assured, too out of place, or so he thought. Ray's voice cut through the noise, abrupt and cold. "Excuse me, ma'am. Stop right there." Jasmine halted, startled by the command. She turned to see Ray approaching, his expression unreadable but stern. Passers-by slowed, sensing tension, and Jasmine felt a knot of anxiety tighten in her stomach. This was not the first time she had been singled out, but it was the first time it had happened so publicly, with so many eyes watching. "Is there a problem, officer?" Jasmine asked, her tone calm yet resolute. Ray narrowed his eyes. "There's been a report of suspicious activity. I need to see your identification." Jasmine's heart raced, but she maintained her composure. She knew her rights, and she knew what this was. Another instance of racial profiling that she had written about countless times. Her followers would not believe it if she told them this was happening to her. Not here, not on Fifth Avenue. "Suspicious activity. I'm just walking, officer," Jasmine replied, her voice steady but edged with defiance. "This feels unnecessary. Are you stopping everyone who looks like me?" A few people nearby paused, glancing at each other with raised eyebrows. Whispers began to ripple through the crowd. Someone in the crowd muttered, "Isn't that Jasmine Carter, the blogger?" A few smartphones emerged, camera apps activated, and people began recording the unfolding scene. Ray noticed the growing crowd, but he was focused on asserting his authority. "Ma'am, I'm not asking twice. Show me your ID, or I'll be forced to detain you." Jasmine's jaw tightened. She could feel the familiar burn of frustration mixed with fear, but she refused to let it control her. She reached for her phone and held it up, activating her camera. "I'm documenting this. I want people to see what's happening here." The onlookers grew more animated, some nodding in solidarity, others expressing shock. Ray's face flushed slightly, but he remained firm. "Put the phone down and turn around," he ordered, reaching for his handcuffs. His tone was resolute, almost mechanical. Jasmine took a deep breath, her eyes locking onto Ray's with a fierce determination. "I'm not resisting, officer, but I will not be silenced." In one swift motion, Ray snapped the cuffs onto her wrists, the cold metal biting into her skin. A collective gasp echoed through the crowd. Cameras flashed, people whispered, and the world seemed to pause, fixated on this moment. Jasmine's head held high, her eyes never leaving Ray's, as if daring him to acknowledge the injustice of his actions. As Ray led Jasmine toward the patrol car, the bystanders' murmurs grew louder, shifting from shock to anger. "She didn't do anything," someone shouted. "This is profiling," another person cried. Jasmine could hear snippets of their outrage, but her focus remained on staying calm. She knew her rights, and she knew that her voice, her presence, would not be silenced. She could already imagine the blog post she would write, the impact it would have, the conversations it would spark. Her followers, Carter's crew, would undoubtedly rally behind her, amplifying her story far beyond this New York street corner. As she was placed in the back of the police car, her phone buzzed in her pocket, a notification from her social media app. She didn't need to check to know that people were already posting about what was happening. Videos were likely flooding Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok. Her story had gone viral in seconds. Ray shut the door with a grim expression, but a flicker of doubt flashed across his face. He had only intended to investigate, to do his job, but this was escalating beyond his control. He glanced at the crowd, at the phones recording every detail. He could feel the weight of their stares, the judgment hanging thick in the air. As the patrol car pulled away, Jasmine's mind raced, alternating between fear and resolve. She knew this moment was larger than her. It was a symbol, a catalyst for change. She thought about all the people she had written for, the marginalized, the misunderstood, the ones who were judged by appearances, and she knew that her voice would be louder than ever before. Back at the precinct, Ray felt the unease settle deeper as he led Jasmine to a holding cell. He could sense the eyes of his colleagues on him, some watching with sympathy, others with disbelief. The murmurs had already begun. "Isn't that the activist? The blogger?" Ray's superior, Sergeant Edwards, approached with a furrowed brow. "Thompson, what's going on here?" "She matched a description we received," Ray replied, his voice less certain than before. Edwards looked from Ray to Jasmine, his gaze lingering on her calm, unyielding expression. "That woman you just detained, she's not just anyone. You might want to check the news. This is going to be big." Ray's heart sank as he caught a glimpse of his colleagues glancing at their phones, faces lighting up in recognition. The hashtag Justice for Jasmine was already trending, the video of her arrest gaining traction at an alarming speed. Jasmine sat in the holding cell, her posture regal, her gaze steady. She was ready to turn this moment into a movement, ready to use her voice louder than ever, and ready to make sure that Ray Thompson and the world would remember her name. As Jasmine sat in the holding cell, the weight of her situation settled over her. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting a sterile glow that made the cell feel colder and smaller than it was. The hard metal bench beneath her was uncomfortable, and the cuffs had left red marks around her wrists. But Jasmine was not one to be broken by discomfort. She straightened her back, her chin held high, as she replayed the events in her mind. Outside the walls of the precinct, the world was buzzing. Videos of her arrest were spreading like wildfire across social media, accompanied by a single powerful hashtag. Justice for Jasmine. Her followers, known as Carter's crew, were outraged, flooding Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook with messages of support and calls for accountability. Jasmine's face, her expression calm but defiant as she was led into the patrol car, had become a symbol for something much larger, a movement against the profiling and mistreatment that people of color faced every day. In newsrooms across New York City, editors scrambled to cover the unfolding story. Within hours, national media outlets were picking up the story, eager to report on the high-profile arrest. Reporters dug into Jasmine's background, discovering her impressive following and the impact of her blog, Unfiltered Truth. She was not just any woman. She was a voice for justice, someone who had already challenged social norms and inspired thousands. This wasn't just a minor arrest. This was a scandal, and it was gaining momentum. Back at the precinct, Officer Ray Thompson was beginning to feel the consequences of his actions. He had intended to make a routine arrest based on a vague description, but now he was the center of a media frenzy. His colleagues were watching him with a mixture of curiosity and judgment, whispering amongst themselves as they scrolled through the viral videos on their phones. "Did you see that hashtag?" One officer murmured to another. "It's all over Twitter. People are calling for his suspension." "Who is she, anyway?" another asked. Didn't he know she was famous? Ray heard fragments of their conversations, his jaw tightening. He felt the prickling sense of losing control over a situation he thought was straightforward. He was used to following protocol, maintaining authority, and asserting his presence on the streets. But this was different. This was spiraling beyond his grasp. His superior, Sergeant Edwards, pulled him into a small office. Edwards's expression was tense, his lips pressed into a thin line as he gestured for Ray to sit down. "Thompson, what were you thinking?" Edwards began, his voice low but simmering with frustration. "You just arrested one of the most influential bloggers in the country. This is a PR nightmare." Ray shifted uncomfortably, feeling a rare pang of self-doubt. "She matched the description we got." "I was just following orders," he replied, his tone defensive. Edwards sighed, rubbing his temples. "Do you have any idea what's happening outside this building right now? There's a crowd forming. Reporters, protesters, people demanding answers. They're calling us out for racial profiling, Thompson. This isn't just about you. This is about the entire department's reputation." Ray opened his mouth to respond, but no words came. He had seen protests before, heard people call for accountability, but he never thought he would be at the center of it. The realization unsettled him. Outside the precinct, the crowd continued to swell. Dozens of people gathered, holding signs that read "Justice for Jasmine" and "Stop Racial Profiling." Some held up their phones, streaming live to their followers, while others chanted Jasmine's name. Among them were young activists, college students, and even local celebrities who had seen Jasmine's arrest unfold online and had come to show their support. Reporters jostled for position, cameras flashing as they captured the scene. News vans lined the street, each outlet vying for exclusive footage and soundbites. The crowd's energy was electric, fueled by a collective anger that was about more than Jasmine. It was about years of feeling unseen, dismissed, and disrespected. Inside the precinct, Jasmine could hear the muffled sounds of chanting and shouts echoing through the walls. She felt a surge of pride, knowing that her community had shown up for her, that they were standing beside her even when she was alone in this sterile, unforgiving cell. She was not just one person. She was part of a larger movement, and that movement was making its presence known. A young officer named Brian, fresh out of the academy, was assigned to monitor Jasmine's cell. He watched her with a mixture of awe and sympathy. He had seen the videos on his phone during his lunch break, realizing who she was only after she had been brought in. Brian felt a pang of discomfort, an internal conflict between his duty and his personal sense of justice. "Miss Carter," he said quietly, approaching her cell. I just wanted to say I'm sorry for what happened. I've read your blog. You've inspired a lot of people, including me." Jasmine looked up, her expression softening as she studied the young officer. She saw the sincerity in his eyes, the hesitation of someone who was still figuring out his role in a complicated world. "Thank you, Officer Brian." "Officer Brian Lewis." "Thank you, Officer Lewis," she said, offering him a small, appreciative smile. "I hope you'll remember this moment. Sometimes standing for what's right means questioning what's easy." Brian nodded, her words resonating with him in a way he hadn't expected. He wanted to say more, to express his frustration with the system that had put them both in this position. But he knew his place. He offered her a nod and returned to his post, his mind racing with questions about the role he wanted to play in law enforcement. As the afternoon wore on, the precinct received calls from city officials, demanding an explanation for Jasmine's arrest. Ray was summoned back into the office, where a senior officer informed him that Jasmine would be released, effective immediately. The mayor's office had intervened, aware of the growing backlash, and determined to prevent a larger scandal. When Ray returned to Jasmine's cell, he avoided her gaze, his jaw clenched. He opened the door and gestured for her to follow him, his pride wounded by the turn of events. "You're free to go," he muttered, the bitterness in his tone barely concealed. Jasmine didn't respond immediately. She rose from the bench with quiet dignity, stepping out of the cell with her head held high. As she passed Ray, she paused, looking him in the eye with a gaze that was calm but unyielding. "This isn't over, Officer Thompson," she said softly. "This moment will ripple far beyond these walls. People are watching." Ray's face darkened, but he said nothing, his authority overshadowed by the knowledge that he had become part of a story he could no longer control. As Jasmine exited the precinct, the crowd erupted into cheers. Cameras flashed, reporters surged forward, and her supporters reached out to touch her shoulder, offering words of encouragement and solidarity. Jasmine felt the warmth of their presence, the energy of a community united by a shared vision of justice and change. She turned to face the cameras, her voice steady as she addressed the crowd. "Today, I was detained for no reason other than the color of my skin and my presence in this city. But this isn't just about me. This is about the countless others who have faced the same treatment, but didn't have a crowd to support them, who didn't have cameras to capture their truth. We stand together, not just for justice for me, but for justice for all." The crowd's applause was thunderous, and the chant of "Justice for Jasmine" filled the air once more. In that moment, Jasmine knew that this was more than a personal battle. It was a turning point, a chance to shine a light on a problem that had been hidden for too long. As she made her way through the crowd, surrounded by her supporters, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. This experience had shaken her, but it had also solidified her resolve. She would not let this moment pass without action. She would use her platform, her voice, and her influence to make sure that what happened to her did not happen to others. Inside the precinct, Ray Thompson watched from a window, his expression conflicted. He saw the crowd rallying behind Jasmine, the passion in their faces, the determination in her stance. For the first time, he wondered if maybe, just maybe, he had been wrong. But the world had already moved forward, with or without his realization. Jasmine's story was out there, and the movement had begun. The days following Jasmine's arrest unfolded like a storm, gaining strength with each passing hour. The hashtag #JusticeForJasmine had become more than just a trend. It was a rallying cry. Across the country, people took to social media, sharing stories of their own encounters with racial profiling and calling for systemic change. Jasmine's arrest had tapped into a well of collective frustration, giving voice to countless individuals who had experienced similar injustices but had never had a platform to share their stories. News outlets featured the story prominently, with headlines like "Influential Blogger Arrested Without Cause" and "Justice for Jasmine Sparks Nationwide Protests Against Racial Profiling." The arrest had quickly become more than a local incident. It was now a national conversation about accountability, policing, and prejudice. Jasmine's face appeared on television screens, in online articles, and on protest signs. She had become a symbol, a representation of resilience and the fight for justice. At her apartment, Jasmine sat by the window, her laptop open, as she read through the thousands of messages flooding her inbox. Every few minutes, her phone buzzed with notifications, followers reaching out, journalists requesting interviews, activists asking for collaborations. It was overwhelming, yet empowering. She had always used her platform to speak out, but now she felt a greater responsibility than ever before. Her friend and manager, Tiana, sat across from her, scrolling through Twitter on her phone. Tiana had been with Jasmine since the early days of her blog, back when Unfiltered Truth had only a small following. She was fiercely protective of Jasmine, and seeing her friend's face on the news had stirred a mixture of pride and anger. "Girl, you have no idea how big this is getting," Tiana said, her eyes wide with excitement. "Look at this. People are organizing protests in Atlanta, Chicago. Lay people are standing up because of you." Jasmine glanced at Tiana, a slight smile tugging at her lips. "It's not just me, T. It's everyone who's been through something like this. I'm just the spark." Tiana shook her head, admiration in her eyes. "You're more than that, Jasmine. You've given people hope. You're showing them that they don't have to be silent." As they spoke, Jasmine's phone rang. She glanced at the screen and saw an unfamiliar number. She hesitated, then answered. "Hello, this is Jasmine Carter." "Miss Carter, my name is Maria Torres. I'm a civil rights attorney based here in New York, and I've been following your case closely," the woman on the other end said, her voice calm but authoritative. "I wanted to reach out because I believe there are legal grounds for a civil lawsuit against the NYPD for unlawful detention and racial profiling." Jasmine's heart skipped a beat. A lawsuit. She had considered her options, but the idea of legal action had felt daunting. Still, she knew that holding the NYPD accountable could bring lasting change, not just for herself, but for everyone who had been unfairly targeted. "I'm interested, Ms. Torres. What would that involve?" Jasmine asked, her voice steady despite the excitement bubbling within her. "Well, I'd like to meet with you in person to go over the details," Maria replied. "If we move forward, we'll be making a powerful statement, not just for you, but for anyone who's been mistreated by law enforcement. This could be an important step toward reform." Jasmine agreed to meet with Maria the following day. After ending the call, she turned to Tiana, who was watching her with a raised eyebrow. "You're thinking about suing the NYPD?" Tiana asked, a grin spreading across her face. "Girl, you're going to change the world." Jasmine laughed, the sound filled with both excitement and nervous energy. "I just want justice, T. For me, for everyone." The next day, Jasmine arrived at Maria's office in downtown Manhattan. The building was a nondescript structure, its facade plain and unremarkable, but inside, the atmosphere was charged with purpose. Maria's office was lined with shelves full of thick legal books, each spine bearing the weight of justice, and her desk was covered with neatly stacked files. Maria herself was a force to be reckoned with, a woman in her 40s with sharp features, an intense gaze, and an air of quiet confidence. She rose to greet Jasmine with a firm handshake and a welcoming smile. "Thank you for meeting with me, Miss Carter," Maria said, gesturing for Jasmine to take a seat. "I've been an attorney for 20 years, and cases like yours are exactly why I went into this field. What happened to you was wrong, and it's time we held those responsible accountable." Jasmine nodded, feeling a surge of gratitude. "Thank you, Miss Torres. I want to make a difference. I want to use this experience to bring attention to the larger issue." Maria leaned forward, her expression serious. "That's exactly what we'll do. We'll file a civil lawsuit against the NYPD for unlawful detention and racial profiling. The case will be public, which means we'll have the opportunity to expose the systemic issues within the department. But you should know, it won't be easy. The NYPD is a powerful institution, and they'll fight back." Jasmine took a deep breath, her resolve hardening. "I'm ready. Whatever it takes, I'm ready." Over the next few weeks, Maria and Jasmine worked tirelessly to prepare their case. They gathered evidence, collected testimonies from witnesses who had seen the arrest, and compiled a list of similar incidents involving racial profiling within the NYPD. Maria brought in experts to analyze the police department's practices, revealing patterns of discrimination that had gone unchecked for years. Meanwhile, the media continued to cover Jasmine's story, with news anchors and talk show hosts discussing the case and the broader implications of racial profiling. Jasmine appeared on several shows, sharing her experience and calling for justice, her voice unwavering and passionate. Every interview, every appearance, strengthened the movement. The lawsuit also drew the attention of other civil rights organizations who offered their support and resources. The NAACP, the ACLU, and other advocacy groups rallied behind Jasmine, organizing rallies and public forums to discuss the need for police reform. The movement had taken on a life of its own, transcending Jasmine's individual story to become a fight for accountability and equality. But not everyone was supportive. Jasmine received hate mail and threats, messages from people who saw her actions as divisive. They accused her of being anti-police, of trying to create unrest. Jasmine read the messages with a heavy heart, but she refused to let them silence her. She knew the difference between justice and hatred, between fighting for equality and sowing discord. One night, as she sat in her apartment reviewing the case files, she received a message from an unexpected source. Officer Brian Lewis, the young officer who had spoken to her in the holding cell. "Hi, Miss Carter. I don't know if you remember me, but I was the officer who spoke to you after your arrest. I just wanted to reach out because I've been following your case, and I want you to know that I support what you're doing. There are a lot of good cops who believe in justice and fairness. I'm one of them. Keep fighting." Jasmine felt a swell of emotion as she read his message. It was a reminder that change was possible, even within the system she was fighting against. There were people on the inside who wanted reform just as much as she did. She replied, thanking him for his support and encouraging him to keep standing up for what was right. As the trial date approached, the tension surrounding the case reached a fever pitch. The city braced for what promised to be a historic moment. Supporters of Jasmine's cause gathered outside the courthouse, their voices filling the air with chants of "Justice for Jasmine" and "End racial profiling." Reporters lined the sidewalks, their cameras ready to capture every moment. Jasmine arrived at the courthouse with Tiana and Maria by her side. As she stepped out of the car, she was met with cheers and applause from the crowd. She felt a surge of pride and determination, knowing that she was not walking into that courthouse alone. She was carrying the hopes and dreams of everyone who had ever felt invisible, everyone who had ever been judged unfairly. Inside, Officer Ray Thompson sat in the courtroom, his expression strained. He had become a reluctant symbol of the issues within the NYPD, and he knew that his career and his conscience were on trial as much as Jasmine's case was. He felt the weight of his decisions, the knowledge that his actions had sparked a movement he could never have anticipated. As Jasmine took her seat at the plaintiff's table, she glanced across the courtroom at Ray. Their eyes met for a brief, charged moment, and in that silent exchange, there was a flicker of understanding, a recognition of the gravity of what was about to unfold. This trial was not just about her arrest. It was about justice, about accountability, and about the power of one person's voice to ignite change. As the judge entered the room and the trial began, Jasmine felt a calm settle over her. She was ready for the battle ahead. She had come too far, endured too much, to turn back now. This was her moment to make a difference, not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever dared to stand up for what was right. The courtroom was packed to capacity on the first day of the trial. Every seat was filled, with journalists and spectators standing along the back walls, eager to witness what promised to be a pivotal case. Outside, a crowd of protesters had gathered, their signs held high as they chanted for justice and reform. The atmosphere was charged with anticipation, and everyone present seemed to understand the significance of this moment. Jasmine sat beside her attorney, Maria Torres, feeling a mix of emotions. She had prepared herself for this day, but the weight of it still pressed down on her. She knew that her case was about more than her personal experience. It was about shining a light on a broken system, about creating a path toward accountability and change. The trial began with opening statements. Maria spoke first, her voice clear and resolute as she addressed the jury. Ladies and gentlemen, we are here today to seek justice for Jasmine Carter. Ms. Carter was detained without cause, humiliated in public, and treated as though her rights were secondary. This case is not just about one woman's experience. It's about a system that allows prejudice to dictate who is seen as suspicious, who is treated with dignity, and who is denied their basic rights. We intend to show that Ms. Carter's arrest was not an isolated incident, but part of a larger pattern of racial profiling within the NYPD. The jurors listened intently, their expressions serious as they absorbed Maria's words. The courtroom was silent, each person hanging on her every word. On the other side of the courtroom, the defense attorney, a man named Robert Miller, prepared to make his case. He was a seasoned lawyer, known for his success in defending high-profile cases involving law enforcement. He stood up, adjusted his tie, and addressed the jury with a tone of calm authority. Ladies and gentlemen, Officer Ray Thompson was simply doing his job. He received a report of a suspicious individual, and he acted on that information, as any diligent officer would. This is not a case of prejudice or profiling. This is a case of an officer following protocol, working to keep our city safe. We ask you to consider the facts and avoid jumping to conclusions based on public perception. As Robert spoke, Jasmine felt a pang of frustration. She knew that the defense would try to paint Ray's actions as standard procedure, as if her experience was just a misunderstanding, an unfortunate inconvenience. But she was determined to make sure the truth was heard. The first witness called to the stand was Officer Ray Thompson himself. He wore his uniform, his posture rigid as he took the oath, and sat in the witness chair. His expression was tense, and there was a flicker of discomfort in his eyes as he looked out at the packed courtroom. Maria approached him, her voice steady but firm. "Officer Thompson, can you please explain why you stopped Ms. Carter on the day of her arrest?" Ray cleared his throat, his gaze shifting slightly. "I received a call about a suspicious person in the area. The description I received matched Ms. Carter, so I approached her to investigate. My intention was to ensure public safety." Maria nodded, pacing slightly as she considered his answer. "Public safety is important, of course. But tell me, officer, did Ms. Carter exhibit any behavior that would indicate she was a threat? Did she act in any way that would justify her detention?" Ray hesitated, a faint blush rising on his cheeks. "No, she didn't, but I was following up on the report I received." Maria's expression sharpened. "So you detained her without any evidence of suspicious behavior, solely based on a vague report?" Ray shifted in his seat, uncomfortable under her scrutiny. "I was doing my job. Sometimes we have to make quick decisions in the field." Maria held his gaze, her voice calm but pointed. "Quick decisions, officer, or assumptions. Isn't it true that you made an assumption about Ms. Carter based on her appearance, rather than any concrete evidence of wrongdoing?" Ray's face flushed, and he avoided her gaze. He didn't answer immediately, and the silence in the courtroom was palpable. Finally, he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "Yes, I made an assumption." The admission hung heavy in the air, and Jasmine felt a surge of vindication. Ray's words confirmed what she had known all along, that she had been judged unfairly, treated as suspicious simply because of how she looked. When Maria finished her questioning, Robert Miller stood to cross-examine. He attempted to shift the narrative, emphasizing the importance of quick decision-making in law enforcement. He painted Ray as a dedicated officer doing his best in a difficult job. But the damage was done. Ray's admission had cracked open the case, revealing the bias that lay at the heart of Jasmine's arrest. Over the next several days, more witnesses were called to the stand. Maria presented testimony from experts who analyzed the NYPD's practices, revealing a troubling pattern of racial profiling in the department. Statistical data showed that people of color were disproportionately targeted for stops and searches, even in situations where there was no evidence of criminal behavior. The numbers were stark, undeniable, and they painted a picture of systemic bias. Outside the courthouse, the movement continued to grow. Jasmine's supporters organized rallies and marches, calling for police reform and an end to racial profiling. The streets were filled with people holding signs that read "Equal Justice" and "Stop the Bias." The city was alive with energy, a collective call for change that could no longer be ignored. One evening, after a long day in court, Jasmine returned home to find a handwritten letter slipped under her door. She opened it, curious, and saw that it was from a stranger, an elderly woman named Margaret who had seen Jasmine's story on the news. "Dear Jasmine," the letter began, "I am 82 years old, and I have lived in this city my entire life. I remember the days of segregation, the times when people of color were not allowed to sit at certain counters or use certain restrooms. I thought we had moved past those days, but watching what happened to you reminded me that we still have a long way to go. Thank you for standing up, for not letting them silence you. You are carrying the torch that so many of us lit years ago. Keep fighting, dear. The world needs your courage." Jasmine felt a lump in her throat as she read the letter. Margaret's words were a reminder that the fight for justice was not a new one, that she was part of a legacy of people who had stood up against injustice, who had demanded change even when the odds were stacked against them. The next day in court, Maria called Jasmine to the stand. As she took her place in the witness chair, Jasmine felt the weight of all the people who had supported her, all the people who believed in her cause. She was ready to tell her story, to make sure that her voice was heard. Maria's questions were gentle but probing, allowing Jasmine to recount her experience in her own words. She spoke about the fear she had felt, the humiliation and the anger. She described the moment she was handcuffed, the way people stared at her, and the helplessness of being treated like a criminal despite having done nothing wrong. "I wasn't just arrested," Jasmine said, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "I was stripped of my dignity in front of a crowd of strangers. I was made to feel like I was less than, simply because of how I looked. This isn't just about one person. It's about a system that allows people to be judged by their appearance, by their race, instead of by their character." The courtroom was silent, everyone listening intently. Some jurors' eyes glistened with tears, and even Officer Ray Thompson looked affected, his expression troubled as he avoided Jasmine's gaze. When Maria finished her questioning, Robert Miller approached Jasmine, his tone calm but calculating. He attempted to undermine her story, suggesting that she had misinterpreted Ray's intentions, that she had overreacted. But Jasmine held her ground, her responses measured and resolute. "I didn't overreact, Mr. Miller," she said firmly. "I reacted exactly as anyone would when they're treated unfairly. I spoke up because I refuse to let people silence me, because I believe that we all deserve to be treated with respect." Her words resonated, echoing in the hearts of everyone present. Jasmine's testimony was more than a recounting of events. It was a call to action, a demand for accountability and change. As she stepped down from the witness stand, Jasmine felt a sense of relief. She had told her truth, shared her experience, and she knew that the impact of her words would linger long after the trial was over. Outside, the crowd continued to grow, their chants of "Justice for Jasmine" filling the air. She could hear them as she left the courthouse, their voices a reminder that she was not alone in this fight. Jasmine knew that whatever the outcome, she had already won something far more valuable than a legal victory. She had inspired others to stand up, to speak out, to demand the respect and dignity they deserved. This was more than a trial. It was a movement, and Jasmine Carter was at its heart. The trial continued, each day drawing more attention and supporters, transforming Jasmine's journey into a movement that extended far beyond the walls of the courtroom. Across the country, Jasmine's story was sparking conversations about justice, prejudice, and the urgent need for change. Colleges, community centers, and even corporate offices were hosting forums to discuss racial profiling and police accountability, inspired by the courage Jasmine had shown in standing up to the NYPD. In New York, marches became a common sight. Thousands of people gathered in Union Square, carrying signs that read, "I am Jasmine," and "Equality for all." Young activists, seasoned civil rights leaders, and everyday citizens joined together, their voices echoing through the city's streets. This wasn't just about Jasmine Carter anymore. It was about a collective demand for dignity, respect, and equality. Inside the courthouse, the trial was entering its final phase. Both sides had presented their evidence and witnesses, and the tension was palpable as each day inched closer to the verdict. Maria Torres, Jasmine's attorney, knew that they had a strong case, but she also understood the complexities of the legal system and the barriers that often came with it. On the other side of the courtroom, Officer Ray Thompson sat with a conflicted expression. The trial had brought his life under intense scrutiny, casting a harsh light on his role in Jasmine's unjust arrest. For the first time, Ray began to question the system he had spent his entire career defending. He thought about the day he had stopped Jasmine, the assumptions he had made, and the way he had allowed his authority to override his better judgment. And as much as he hated to admit it, he could see how deeply ingrained bias had influenced his actions. That afternoon, as the court took a brief recess, Ray found himself alone in the hallway, his thoughts swirling. Before he knew it, Jasmine approached him, her gaze steady but not unkind. They hadn't exchanged more than a few words outside of the courtroom, but in that moment, it felt as though there was an unspoken understanding between them. "Officer Thompson," Jasmine said, her voice soft but firm. "I don't know if you'll ever fully understand the impact of what happened that day, but I hope this trial has opened your eyes to what so many people face every day." Ray looked down, feeling the weight of her words. "I've been thinking about it a lot," he admitted, his tone quiet. "I never wanted to be the kind of person who judged others, but I can see now that I was wrong. I let my position get in the way of seeing you as a person." Jasmine nodded, appreciating his honesty. "We all have to confront our biases, Officer Thompson. What matters is that you're willing to see it, to do better. This isn't just about me. It's about changing a system that hurts countless people who don't have a platform, who don't have anyone to defend them." Ray nodded, feeling the newfound sense of responsibility. This was his moment to make a choice, to either remain defensive, holding tightly to his authority, or to step back and recognize the harm that had been done, not just to Jasmine, but to countless others. As the court reconvened, Ray took his seat with a renewed sense of humility, knowing that he would leave this trial a different man than he had been when it began. Whether or not the jury ruled in Jasmine's favor, he knew that his own role in the case would haunt him for years to come, a reminder of the ways in which he, and the system he represented, had failed. Back in the courtroom, Maria delivered her closing argument with a passion that held the jury captive. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice strong and unwavering, "this case is about more than one woman's experience. It's about the values we hold as a society." Jasmine Carter was treated as a suspect, as a threat, simply because of the way she looked. She was judged without reason, detained without cause, and humiliated in a way that no person should ever endure. If we do not stand against this injustice, then we allow it to continue. We must send a message that discrimination, bias, and prejudice have no place in our society. Ms. Carter's courage in speaking up, in facing this humiliation with dignity, has given us all a chance to reflect on who we are and who we want to be. I urge you to consider her bravery, her truth, and to find in favor of justice. The courtroom was silent as Maria took her seat, her words leaving a powerful impact on everyone present. The jurors exchanged glances, their expressions thoughtful, as they prepared to deliberate. Robert Miller, the defense attorney, rose to deliver his closing statement. He attempted to frame Ray's actions as necessary, a matter of protocol, but his words felt hollow in the face of everything that had been revealed. The jurors' faces remained impassive, and even the courtroom spectators seemed unconvinced. The evidence of bias, of prejudice within the system, was too glaring to ignore. After closing arguments concluded, the judge instructed the jury and dismissed them to deliberate. The tension in the room was palpable as everyone waited, each person acutely aware of the significance of the verdict. Hours passed, and evening began to settle over the city. Outside the courthouse, supporters remained gathered, refusing to leave until they knew the outcome. News cameras captured the scene, broadcasting live as people held vigil, their faces lit by the glow of candles and smartphones. Jasmine sat quietly in the waiting room, surrounded by Maria, Tiana, and a few close friends. The wait felt excruciating, each minute stretching endlessly as she wrestled with her emotions. She was exhausted, drained by the weight of the trial, yet she knew that whatever happened, she had made a difference. She had spoken her truth, and her story had resonated with thousands. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, a bailiff entered the room. The jury has reached a verdict. Jasmine took a deep breath, her heart pounding as she rose to her feet. Her friends offered her reassuring smiles, but she could see the worry in their eyes. This was the moment that would determine not only her fate, but the impact of her story on a larger scale. The courtroom was packed as everyone returned to their seats, the air thick with anticipation. Jasmine held her breath as the judge addressed the jury foreperson. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" the judge asked. The foreperson, a middle-aged woman with a steady gaze, nodded. "Yes, Your Honor." The judge gestured for her to continue. "What is your verdict?" The foreperson unfolded a piece of paper and began to read. "In the matter of Jasmine Carter versus the New York Police Department, we, the jury, find in favor of the plaintiff, Jasmine Carter." A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom, followed by a burst of applause. Tears sprang to Jasmine's eyes as the weight of the verdict sank in. She had won. She had stood up against an unjust system, and she had prevailed. Ray Thompson sat silently, his face a mix of relief and remorse. He knew that the verdict was just, that Jasmine had deserved this victory. He could only hope that this experience would serve as a turning point, not only for himself but for the department and the city as a whole. Jasmine's supporters gathered around her, hugging her, congratulating her. She felt a profound sense of gratitude for each person who had stood by her, for everyone who had believed in her fight for justice. Outside, the crowd erupted in cheers as news of the verdict spread. People chanted her name, celebrating a victory that felt deeply personal, a triumph over a system that had too often dismissed their voices. Jasmine stepped outside the courthouse, greeted by the glow of cameras and the cheers of her supporters. She raised her hand, signaling for quiet as she prepared to address the crowd. "This is not just my victory," she said, her voice steady, but filled with emotion. "This is a victory for every person who has ever felt judged, dismissed, or mistreated because of how they look. This is a message to everyone who has faced injustice that you are not alone, that your voice matters. We still have a long way to go, but today we took a step toward a future where justice is truly for all." The crowd roared, their applause a tribute to her courage, her resilience, and the movement she had inspired. That night, as Jasmine returned home, she sat quietly by her window, looking out at the city lights. She felt a deep sense of peace, knowing that she had done something that mattered, something that would make a difference in the lives of others. Her story was no longer just her own. It had become a beacon, a reminder that justice was worth fighting for. As she closed her eyes, she knew that this was only the beginning. The journey toward justice was far from over, but she was ready to keep moving forward, to continue speaking out, to make sure that every voice was heard. And somewhere in the city, Officer Ray Thompson sat alone, contemplating his own path forward, realizing that he too had a role to play in the fight for a fairer, more just world. The weeks after the trial were a whirlwind for Jasmine. She had gone from being an outspoken blogger to a national symbol of resilience and justice. Every major news outlet wanted to interview her. Civil rights organizations reached out with invitations to speak at events, and her social media following doubled almost overnight. For many, Jasmine Carter had become a hero, a reminder that one person's courage could ignite a movement and hold an entire system accountable. But fame was not her goal. Jasmine had always believed in using her platform to create change, and now, with the world's attention on her, she knew it was time to take her fight further. One morning, As she sat by her window with a cup of coffee, she received a call from Maria Torres, her attorney. They had kept in close touch since the trial, becoming more than just lawyer and client. They had become friends and allies in a shared cause. "Jasmine," Maria began, her tone excited. "I just got off the phone with the city council. They want to talk to us about implementing changes within the NYPD. Your case has sparked real momentum for reform." Jasmine's heart quickened. "What kind of changes?" Maria explained. "They're considering implementing mandatory anti-bias training, revising the standards for stop and search procedures, and even establishing an independent oversight committee to investigate cases of racial profiling. They're willing to hear us out, to actually listen." Jasmine felt a surge of hope. For years, she had written about these very issues, advocating for accountability and reform, but she had never imagined that her words would lead to something so tangible, so immediate. "That's incredible," Jasmine replied, her voice brimming with emotion. "Tell me when and where, and I'll be there." Over the next few weeks, Jasmine and Maria attended meetings with city officials, police representatives, and community leaders. These were intense, often heated discussions. Some officials were resistant, wary of the changes they believed would disrupt standard police practices. But Jasmine remained resolute, speaking with the same calm strength she had shown throughout the trial. One afternoon, during a particularly contentious meeting, a senior police officer voiced his opposition to the proposed reforms. He argued that anti-bias training was unnecessary, that officers were already equipped to make fair decisions. Jasmine looked him in the eye, her voice steady but firm. "With all due respect, officer, I was arrested without cause simply because I was seen as suspicious in the eyes of your department. If that's not evidence that something needs to change, then I don't know what is." The room fell silent, the weight of her words settling over everyone. Even those who had initially resisted the changes seemed to understand, to feel the undeniable truth in her statement. Gradually, the reforms began to take shape. The City Council approved funding for comprehensive anti-bias training, and new guidelines were introduced to limit unjustified stops. An independent oversight committee was established, tasked with investigating complaints of racial profiling and ensuring accountability within the police force. Jasmine's case had become a catalyst for change, and her name was spoken with respect and admiration across the city. But Jasmine didn't stop there. Inspired by the impact of her case, she decided to create something lasting, a foundation dedicated to fighting racial injustice and advocating for police reform. She named it the Carter Foundation for Justice, and its mission was simple yet profound: to provide resources for those who experience discrimination, to offer legal aid to victims of unjust treatment, and to continue advocating for systemic change. The Carter Foundation quickly gained momentum, attracting donations from people all over the country. Celebrities, activists, and regular citizens rallied behind Jasmine's cause, eager to support her vision of a more just world. Within months, the foundation had established partnerships with several civil rights organizations, creating a network of support that stretched far beyond New York City. One of the foundation's first projects was a scholarship fund for young people pursuing careers in criminal justice and social advocacy. Jasmine believed that change had to come from within, that the next generation of law enforcement and policymakers needed to be people who understood and valued justice for all. She wanted to inspire young people of color to enter fields where they could make a difference, where they could challenge the system from within and work toward a future free from prejudice. During the foundation's launch event, Jasmine stood before a crowd of supporters, many of whom had followed her story from the beginning. She looked out at the faces of the people who believed in her, who had been inspired by her journey, and felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude. "Thank you all for being here," she began, her voice filled with emotion. "This foundation isn't just about me. It's about every person who has ever felt silenced, every person who has ever been judged unfairly. Together, we are creating a future where justice is not just a word, but a reality." The crowd erupted in applause, their faces reflecting hope, admiration, and a shared commitment to the cause. But one face in the crowd surprised her. Standing near the back, almost hidden among the supporters, was Officer Ray Thompson. Jasmine hadn't seen him since the trial, and his presence stirred a mix of emotions within her. He looked different, less rigid, less sure of himself, as if the trial had stripped away the hardened exterior he had once worn so proudly. After her speech, as the crowd dispersed, Ray approached her hesitantly. He looked nervous, his eyes reflecting a vulnerability she hadn't seen before. "Miss Carter," he began, his voice soft, "I wanted to thank you for everything. I don't expect you to forgive me, but I want you to know that I've been doing a lot of thinking since the trial. I'm leaving the NYPD. I realized that if I want to make a difference, I need to do it from a place of understanding and respect." Jasmine nodded, absorbing his words. "It takes courage to admit when you're wrong, Officer Thompson, and it takes even more courage to make a change." He nodded, looking down, humbled. "I'm planning to volunteer with a community organization, one that works on building trust between law enforcement and the communities they serve. I want to make things right in whatever way I can." Jasmine offered him a small smile. "We all have our own journeys. I'm glad you found yours." Ray gave her a grateful nod before turning to leave. As he walked away, Jasmine felt a sense of closure, a release from the bitterness she had once felt. She hadn't just changed the system. She had changed a person, someone who had once been her adversary, but now understood the importance of justice. Over the following months, the Carter Foundation continued to grow. Jasmine spoke at events across the country, sharing her story, her vision, and her unwavering belief in the power of individual action. She met countless people who had been impacted by her journey, young activists, aspiring lawyers, and community leaders who saw her as a symbol of hope. In time, the foundation became one of the most respected organizations in the field of social justice, with chapters in cities across the nation. Jasmine's name became synonymous with resilience and change, her story a testament to the power of standing up for what was right. One evening, as she walked through the headquarters of her foundation, she noticed a young intern reading through a case file. The intern looked up, her eyes wide with admiration, as she realized who was standing before her. "Miss Carter," the intern said, her voice filled with excitement, "I just wanted to say, you're the reason I'm here. Your story inspired me to pursue a career in law. I want to help people, just like you did." Jasmine felt a swell of pride and gratitude. She had set out to make a difference, and in doing so, she had inspired a new generation to carry the torch. She knew that her work was far from over, but she felt a deep sense of peace, knowing that her story would continue to ripple outward, touching lives and inspiring change for years to come. As Jasmine left the foundation that night, she looked up at the city skyline, the lights reflecting her journey, the struggles, the triumphs, and the unwavering commitment to justice. She had faced adversity, overcome injustice, and, in the process, had changed not only her life, but the lives of countless others. And as she walked away, she knew that her fight for justice was far from over. It was a journey that would continue, a legacy that would grow, fueled by the belief that one voice, one story, could change the world.